quite paradoxical thing that I'm gonna tell you. North Korea is not a real state. It's a simulacrum created by the Soviet Union and continued by Russia today. Do you want to learn more? Let's go on. North Korea is very similar to Transnistria in Moldova, Abkhazia and Ossetia in Georgia, Donbass and Lugansk People's Republics in Ukraine. The same template. Without Russia, this state cannot exist. And during the change from an alcoholic Boris Yeltsin to a KGB officer Vladimir Putin, there was a time of famine in North Korea from 1994 to 1999. Only Putin returned this state into politics again, because it was convenient for him to show how big the socialist republic is. The fat leaders of North Korea would not be able to keep the power without the naivete that exists in the Western world. They would not be able to do it without the compulsory inscription in the army and law enforcement. Almost 50% of North Koreans belong to the system that represses its own population. The history of Korea must be told in three metaphors: the Iron Dome, the Truman Show, and the world in a distorted mirror. Usually, when you encounter a skeptic of the free world, you deal with someone living behind the mirror, someone who tries to look like you, but actually they're doing something behind the wheels. This is the naivete. This is where you think that they're like you, but the diversity really exists here, but not there. And you need to get it right now. The first metaphor to explore is how to put a particular place under a dome. This is a metaphor that exists in Kazakhstan. Its former leader, Nazarbayev, thought of putting the whole capital under a dome so it can be controlled in terms of temperature, but also politically. This metaphor of dome is projected by the Russians onto America. They like to tell the myth that Americans are building a dome to save it from an ecological problem. And the dome is just a regular thinking of a binary mindset where you have the Iron Curtain, the world split in two. That's why I want to explore this metaphor first. Do we really believe that there is a dome for these ex-socialist countries, this red bloc? Probably you've seen the maps that show how Korea was split between the US and the Soviet Union. And this split happened because of different historical reasons. One of them was the defeat of Japanese imperialism. And Japan, China and Russia had its own interests in the area since the late 19th century. Russia started building the Trans-Siberian Road, basically interjecting in the region in 1901 and starting a war against Japan. But they totally lost. But since Russians don't know how to lose, they wanted to repeat this once again. And they used the Second World War as an opportunity. In 1945, they went to Japan and took its territory. This is how the simulacrum state of North Korea started to be built. Today, we see how China and Russia help each other. But it's not a new thing. It's actually a historically liable thing that happened in the 40s when Mao Zedong was a mirror of Joseph Stalin. They had the same interest to defeat their competitors in the region. Although they didn't have money, they didn't have really popular support, they were imperialists that united together and took the power by force. On the side of American occupation, there were at least 16 nations: Greeks, Ethiopians, Philippines. But on the side of North Korea was only the Soviet Union and Chinese. You can calculate how it's possible that this was imbalanced. Of course, the USSR and China had more people, but is it really about representation? It's also really important that in 1945, when the agreement between Truman and Stalin was signed, the Koreans were not invited. Also, the Soviet Union did exactly the same thing as Russia does now. In the UN, presumably an international organization that was created to stop humanitarian crisis, the USSR vetoed any decisions in the region. This is how Korea became outside of the political process that decided its destiny for many, many years, until today. Okay, there is one thing I need to tell you. The Korean elites were actually guilty of surrendering to imperialist powers of Japan and China. For one reason, they always thought of a more progressive way to build politics in the region. They were against monarchism that belonged to Korean history, which is more than any other history in the region. It's as long as Chinese and Japanese. It's not worse or better, it's just different. But because they thought of a more progressive way of governing their own country, Korea, they first signed up for Japanese imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century, and then they supported Kim Il-sung, who came into power supported by the Chinese and Russians. It's a fun fact, or maybe it's a sad fact, that Kim Il-sung did not speak Korean at all. He used prompts to read speeches because his native language was Chinese and he was an officer in the Red Army in the USSR. There is some problem with the elite being created by your neighboring states. These elites become connected to the culture that can actually spoil and then destroy the unity in your country. This is a historical example that investing in culture and elites may be more important than investing in guns, because it's all about what people think, you know, and the elites are the people who lead out of different crises. So I just spoke about the first metaphor, the Iron Dome. The dome that closed a part of Korea and made it separate, different to other part of Korea, made it a simulacrum part. Now I'm gonna move to a different metaphor, the Truman Show. The goal of the Truman Show is to accuse the world in hypocrisy while at the same time doing the most hypocritical things possible. There were two examples for Kim Il-sung, who later became Kim Song-yu, the son, Joseph Stalin, who he used to create the cult of his personality, and Mao Zedong, who inspired him for the Cultural Revolution, which meant actually a genocide for some abstract reasons. These two epitomes of the cult of personality and the Cultural Revolution are still the most important in North Korea. They could not invent anything else. Well, North Korea is a bit better than Eritrea and the Soviet Union in the 50s. Instead of having one channel, it has a second channel that shows Soviet films with subtitles. And for Western visitors, it sometimes shows the CNN International to show how inclusive the society is. This is crucial knowledge that TV starts the occupation of minds. 20 million people? You can zombify them easily. But if you buy into the mythology that is created by Korean and Soviet cinema, you continue it, you spread it around the world. We need to deconstruct what we saw on Korean TV to start from zero. Remember, I told you that this is the Truman Show, and while we have different awards like Nobel Prize for Peace, the Soviet Union had its own awards, like Lenin Awards for Peace. Guess who get it? Kim Jong-un, of course. It's the year 1988. In most countries of the so-called Eastern Bloc, the countries controlled by the Soviet Union unofficially, there is the period of liberalization. The Soviet Union is about to collapse. The period is called perestroika, rebuilding, but North Korea is still created by the templates of Stalinism. And there is a film of 1988 that you can enjoy watching on Channel 2 in North Korea that tells you a story that is very similar to what Russian propaganda tells now about us, Ukrainians. Like the Japanese in 1945, we create biological weapons that must be controlled and destroyed by the liberators from the Soviet Union. This is the same template, which is based on the narratives that the Soviet Union defeated Nazism, and Japan was the part of this world, this binary. If you buy into this, if you continue spreading the word about Azov, Bandera, the right sector, you're just a puppet of this Truman Show. It's your choice, but not every choice is actually the right one. There's one thing that we, as the world, need to do. We need to switch off the channel. We need to stop feeding ourselves with this dope narratives from the Soviet Union about the binary world split between two powers, socialism and capitalism, or fascism and socialism. These are two templates that are used to manufacture the consent that what we see in North Korea is fine. What if North Korea is not an existing country? What if it's just a puppet state to support Russia in its invasions? Let's continue looking at how the Truman Show helps world imperialism and how China and Russia uses it to feed its own politics. There are two side notes that I want to make in concern of the Truman Show metaphor. The first one is that the person who led the cultural resistance to the Soviet Union was a Korean, Viktor Tsoi. He was a TV star. He was the author of the song called Changes. And even today, people who feel a bit nostalgic for the Reconstruction period, or the people who want the Soviet Union to die finally in all parts of the ex-Soviet Union, they sing this song with a guitar, right? This is the Korean, the face of the revolution, but a different one. And the other person is a joker that we are tired of hearing of. It's Donald Trump. Yes, after he left, I started realizing that there is something about him that disturbed the mythology that was in place. Because of his approach of being a bit foolish and also being approachable by totalitarian leaders, he shook up the ground on which demilitarized zone exists. I'll remind you, he went there with two presidents, if you can call a totalitarian leader a president, and made them shake their hands, which was quite unprecedented. The DMZ, the demilitarized zone, was created in the 40s, and no peace treaty was ever signed. So applause to Viktor Tsoi, and let's scratch our head thinking about Donald Trump. And now the third metaphor, the world in a distorted mirror. The distorted mirror is Russia. It creates the reality in which we think that North Korea is real. There is a lot of proof that it's not real. First of all, technology. The internet comes from Russia. The planes come from Russia. Tupolev. The nuclear technology comes from Russia. Exactly. It all comes from Russia. Even the TV comes from Russia, because without Soviet films there would be nothing to show. Russian bloggers spend a lot of time traveling around Vladivostok. It's really close to Pyongyang. It's only 150 kilometers from there, and they often go to the city called Hassan. It's quite interesting that if an American tourist goes there, he would be detained. There are lots of proof of that too. This is the world in a distorted mirror, because it starts creating its own symbolism based on the language of the Soviet Union, but it goes into more ridiculous ways of representing itself. For instance, the sign of Russia is created out of the letters that were used to say the USSR on the border. Now they say Россия, but the letters O and Ya are of different font. Also, there are presidential houses on two sides of the river, of the border that splits Russia and North Korea. They are kind of identical, but when Kim Il-sung died in 1994, it got burnt. And until Putin got into power, it was not reconstructed. Once it's reconstructed, it represents Putin for North Koreans. And in the world of distorted mirrors, it's really important to understand what's the place of China in North Korea. Almost none. Symbolically, the bridge of friendship between North Korea and Russia impedes Chinese to use the Japanese Sea. Well, you may think that these proofs are more superficial than the history that I told you and the Truman Show that keeps us thinking about North Korea as a separate existing state. But it's really interesting how Russians think of North Korea, how their government spends money on insisting about the patriotic war against the Japanese. Now, in Vladivostok and the whole Primorsky Krai, the governor thinks about spending more and more money on telling the story of the beginning of the 20th century to prove that without Russia, there would be no freedom in Korea. And of course, the southern part of Korea is ruled by the USA, which means that it's corrupted, it's degenerative, and it has no future. Well, we all know what's happening in North Korea, right? So that's where I want to stop and ask you once again, do you really think that now, knowing about this, you want to imagine the world under the Iron Dome with a Truman Show that keeps this genocide of just regular people continue, 20 million people, and at the same time, do you really think that we need to buy into this fairy tale so fat leaders can continue exploiting and inscripting regular folks like us into not having the future? Because we believe that everyone has a right to choose. To choose what? Not to have their own lives? To be puppets of a different imperialist country? Yes, maybe you think that Korea can be subjugated to Japanese, to Chinese, not Russians. What would change with that? A lot. Russia now is the worst imperialist power because it rules like it's the 19th century. So if you care about freeing these people, not just because you're Korean yourself, please let us know in the comment section, and don't forget to spread the word and subscribe. Thank you.